Beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth, is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great King. Psalm 48. Shalom and welcome, friends. We're happy you can join us on a reading and exploration of the inspiring story of a brave couple who played a small but significant part in the restoration of the city of the great King, Jerusalem. Window on Mount Zion. This short and moving book tells the story of how Pauline Rose and her husband left England and followed their heritage to the new state of Israel. Undaunted by the fears and warnings of others, they made their home and planted a garden right next to the Arab-Israeli border on the very slopes of Mount Zion, overlooking war-torn Jerusalem. As it flourished and miraculously grew out of barren and rocky soil, the garden became the symbol of the love and peace she desperately longed and hoped would come to a divided country, the living proof of her faith in the God of Israel. Well, we will start today at chapter 1. And I hope you will also be inspired by this precious little book and its wonderful story that's part of the restoration of the state of Israel and particularly of Mount Zion in Jerusalem. I came on my first visit to this land in 1946. And when I reached Jerusalem, something seemed to stir in the depths of my being. I felt that all the journeying and searching of my life had come to an end. Jerusalem held out its golden, welcoming arms to me. We were living in London at the time, and in 1947, against everyone's advice and pleading, I felt a compelling urge to return to Jerusalem to share in the birth pains of the state of Israel. The hardships of the siege of Jerusalem were not easy for any of us, citizens and visitors alike. But where one is bound by love, there is no burden too heavy to bear, and no suffering too great to endure. Jerusalem held me in an ever-tightening embrace. I came from London for some months in each of the following years, until finally, in 1959, Albert, my husband, and I were able to leave London to settle in Israel. For 4 years we lived in temporary homes, knowing that we had not yet found our real home. There was no doubt in our minds that it would be in Jerusalem. But where? And what purpose would there be to our lives? I knew there was something I had to do beyond settling down to a pleasant and comfortable personal life. I waited for some inner guidance. One day I visited my friend Mala, who lived in Tel Aviv and is the sister of Dr. Kahane, the curator of Mount Zion. I had known the family since 1946. Mala had visited us when we were living on a farm in a London suburb, and had never forgotten the beautiful garden we had there. As we sat reminiscing, she suddenly looked at me and said, "Why don't you go and make a garden on Mount Zion?" It seemed an incredible suggestion, and I smiled. How would that be possible? I'd never be allowed to do anything on Mount Zion, and besides, it's a military border zone. "Go and talk to my brother," she said. and then the conversation turned to other subjects. It was like a flash, which gave momentary light, disappearing almost immediately. But for the next few days and nights, the words haunted me and left me no peace. Go and make a garden on Mount Zion. The vision of Mount Zion and the biblical prophecies for its future were always specially illuminated in my mind, but I had no personal connection with it. The phrase linked itself to a verse in Isaiah, which speaks of the beautifying of the sanctuary of the Lord. Surely, I thought, this sanctuary must be Mount Zion. For the Lord said, "Here is my rest forever. Here will I dwell, for I have desired it." I could not rest. I had to go to Mount Zion. "Walk about Mount Zion," said David in his psalm. "Walk about her, go around her." This I set out to do, and came to the foot of the mount. A stone path with winding steps up between the green shrubs and bushes was then the only means of ascent for pilgrims and visitors to Mount Zion. Now, if you can see the picture on the screen, there's Mount Zion. The tower at the top is the Domitian Abbey. And the path Pauline had to climb was down on the left, the very bottom of the hill, and she was winding her way up through the stony ground and the trees that are there on the left-hand side. She was going up the path, and a heavily padlocked barrier barred the approach to a military track which went around the hill. On this day, I slowly and meditatively climbed the steps. I passed the notice board requesting men and women to be suitably dressed and to have their heads covered when visiting this holy hill. On the way up were other notice boards bearing quotations from the Psalms. "Give thanks unto the name of the Lord, for there are set the seats of judgment, the seats of the house of David. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem." And another one, "The Lord is great in Zion. He is high above all the peoples." At the summit, facing the new city of Jerusalem, stood a large old tarnished menorah, which is an 8-branched candlestick, with its twisted arms outstretched. The flying menorah, it was called, which legend claims is the one that Titus took from the temple and placed on an arch in Rome. There, suffering, it waited through the centuries to return to its proper place, the temple on Mount Moriah. When the state of Israel was established, so the legend goes, it received wings and flew back to Jerusalem, seeking the temple. Finding only a mosque with a golden dome in its place, it came to rest on Mount Zion, where it still waits the day when it can return to Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount. Beyond this menorah, a little forest of pine trees, bent by the storms of ages, gave shade in an open space. They too seemed to be waiting for the day that Mount Zion would be restored to its former glory. To the left, a high stone wall enclosed the grounds belonging to the Domitian Church. There again in the picture you can see a view from across the valley looking straight onto Mount Zion. The Domitian Abbey Tower is the landmark there. And you can see part of the road that winds up in the front, which is the road that later Pauline would be able to drive up on her car, which was at first a very bumpy little rocky road. To the right was a large, rambling, deserted building, the great open gashes in its walls roughly filled with stones and debris, its roof a skeleton. Now you can see it here also in the picture in front. That's a restored building that became boys' school and eventually a place for studying the Bible. The bricked-up windows, sandbags, and gun emplacements identified it as the Mount Zion military post, which it was used for at that time. I sat on a bench beneath the branches of the old pine trees. It seemed as if time was momentarily suspended. There was a strange silence, a stillness vibrating with the echoes of past cries and future songs, spanning the centuries of Israel's history from the time of King David. Somewhere near here, King David had conquered the Jebusites, had taken the castle of Zion, and built the city of David. A deep peace pervaded the whole scene, a peace born of prayers that lingered and tears that had spent themselves, a peace deep in the heart of Mount Zion, assured of its glorious future. Then I wandered through the old vaulted building, which according to tradition houses the tomb of King David, the magnet drawing the pilgrims. Part of this building had been restored, but the countless room above it was still in ruins. Where could I make the garden? How could I get permission to live on Mount Zion? I revealed my thoughts and desires to Dr. Kahani. While he sympathized with them, he was gravely concerned for our physical safety and described that he doubted actually that his committee would approve or that the military authorities, who also had a say in the matter, would give permission. It was, after all, a military zone right on the border of the occupied area of Jordan. There's no need to make a garden, and nobody is allowed to live there. It is, after all, a holy sanctuary, and also a dangerous place under present conditions, a border zone. It really isn't a place for anyone to live. Dr. Kahani was silent for a while. Then, impossible, quite impossible, he said with conviction, and with that he considered the matter closed. I could not accept this as the last word. The matter was not ended in my mind. To man, many things are impossible, but to God all things are possible. Both Albert and I felt that if the inspiration to come to Mount Zion was from God, the impossible might well become possible. And so we waited. We were faced with two tremendous obstacles: permission to live on Mount Zion and permission to use the military road. To live here without being allowed to use the road would be difficult in the extreme. The steps up to Mount Zion would be our only means of access. Everything we needed would have to be hauled up on the backs of donkeys. There were endless discussions with the patient curator, and it seemed to me that the ever-repeated "impossible, impossible" was beginning to ring with less conviction. The first break was an offer of a small piece of ground to make a garden. Then I was allowed to have a room where I might rest or occasionally spend the night when working on the garden. Of course, it was clearly understood that I could not live there, and there was always the condition that the garden or room had to be on the safe side of Mount Zion, the side that did not face the border. Well, here, let's just have a look at the picture from the air. If you look on the left-hand side of the picture, just over a third of the way up, you can see the present road that comes across from the left, and then it splits into two. The one on the left goes up to Jaffa Gate, and the one on the right circles around Mount Zion. So at the time, that's the little rough military road that came up and was the border between Mount Zion on the left and the Jordanian occupied side on the right. So that's the road that she's talking about. And if not able to use that military road, they had to climb up that steep little section that's has the trees on the left, and have donkeys to bring up their provisions. So that would be very, very difficult. But now at least she'd been given a little piece of ground to make the garden. And she says, I was grateful for any foothold on Mount Zion. We looked for garden sites and rooms, but each time we found something that appeared to be suitable, we uncovered some hidden snag. However, if we were to be allowed to come to Mount Zion at all, then we believed that all our steps and plans would be guided by the same power that had brought us there. Somewhere on Mount Zion, we would find the place intended for us. The next problem to be faced was how to get permission to use the military road. Our first inquiries met with another impossible. The road was strictly for military use, and nobody else could be given a key with which to unlock the barrier at the base. The military commander of Jerusalem said to us, "It's an extremely foolish idea to want to live in such a dangerous, isolated place when it's not necessary." It was very difficult to explain to him my reasons and the faith underlying them. So, again, we waited. Long weeks passed without a decision. Would we get permission or not? Somehow I knew I had only to wait, and I was willing to do so. Then, one day, without explanation, we received the key to the barrier and permission from the army to use the road. A miracle. Now the confirmation was complete, and the vision had become clearer. We had only now to find the place where we could live and also make a garden on Mount Zion. Now we had the key and could take the car on the military road. As we reached the foot of the hill, a forbidding iron bar, secured by a heavy padlock, stretched across the only road leading to the top of Mount Zion. I was conscious of my excitement and a strong sense of responsibility as I turned the key in the padlock. That would release the giant iron arm which opened the way for the car to pass through. At last I stood on the forbidden road. Conscientiously, I locked the barrier behind me with the key, which had been given to us, on one condition, that it should never pass from our hands. The road was a rough track cut out of the side of the mount for the use of military vehicles. It was dangerously narrow and heavily potholed, and treacherous for a small car, and it curved and climbed sharply with the contours of the hill. But this was not all. On one side, the hill rose high to its stone-walled summit, and on the other it sloped sharply down to the valley of Hinnom. The first curve brought the enemy gun post on the opposite hill alarmingly close, and the armed Arab guards scrutinizing all movement could be clearly seen. With great difficulty the car climbed the narrow track, avoiding large stones and the deep furrows left by the daily quota of heavy military traffic. Almost at the summit, a sharp bend revealed the breathtaking vista of the Judean hills, the hills of biblical history. But it was not the moment to contemplate scenic beauty. My head was suddenly and painfully banged against the roof of the car as it launched into an unseen hole in the road. A few more yards of climbing, and the possibility of further driving ended. I'd stopped the car before a yellow signboard on which was written, "Danger, frontier ahead." And there was another fortification occupied by Jordanian soldiers some yards behind this. High on the hill stood the house occupied by our soldiers, our defense post. Around it were ruined houses left damaged and derelict after the War of Liberation in 1948. My attention was drawn to one in the foreground on the top of the mount. It faced the Jordanian border, scarcely 100 yards away, and it seemed to stand like a silent stone sentinel guarding Mount Zion, its windows looking east, west, and south. It seemed to be calling for life to enter its empty shell, heal its ugly war scars, and light up its darkened windows. I left the car and walked up to the summit of the mount. Nobody was in sight. The stone house I'd seen from below was in ruins. Not far off, flanking an old wall, was a tiny, primitive-looking garden. The fluttering wings of pigeons circled the badly war-damaged house. Through the masses of debris and stones, I risked jumps over small craters and managed to make a precarious entry into the house. I went through a doorway, the damaged doors hanging from their frames, and I crossed gaps in the floor from which the tiles had been removed, and found my way to the staircase which had remained intact. I walked up to the floor above and pushed my way into the room facing the border, and there had my first glimpse through a window on Mount Zion. I stepped onto a small balcony with no certainty that it would hold me. The picture which opened out before me was like a great canvas stretching through time and space. The Judean hills between the Mount of Olives and the Hill of Evil Counsel sloped into the valley of Kidron, which in turn wound around the foot of the mountains and was then lost to view on its way to En-Gedi on the Dead Sea. The little stone houses of the Arab village of Silwan nestled on the hillside. It looked as if they had grown out of the rock. Hidden among the trees on the Hill of Evil Counsel was the building housing the United Nations personnel. A golden glow was diffused over hill and valley alike, and was reflected in the misty blues, mauves, and yellows of the distant mountains of Moab. Rising beyond the Dead Sea, peace and stillness spread like a cloak over the landscape, and it was hard to believe that the enemy was hidden in its folds, and that if I took only a few steps beyond the sign marked "Danger, frontier ahead," I should be shot or taken prisoner. Back inside the house, bullet-riddled walls, broken doors, sandbags, and dirt all told their story. How many young lives had been lost? How many men had been hurt or maimed in the battles for Israel's independence, fought from this house? As I was trying to push open a tightly closed door, I heard footsteps on the stairs. A small, thin, elderly man appeared. Smiling black eyes and a dark-skinned, wrinkled face looked at me with questioning surprise. "Who are you?" I asked. "I am Obadiah," he replied. "I work on Mount Zion and look after the plants and pigeons." He seemed puzzled by my presence. I was curious to see inside this house," I explained. "Where do you come from, Obadiah?" "From Yemen," he answered. "I came here 10 years ago with my wife and our 7 children. I was not strong enough for full-time work, so they gave me light work on Mount Zion. Praised be the name, Baruch Hashem." He looked upwards with shining eyes. It was as though a prayer of thanksgiving was released from his heart and ascended heavenwards. A strange noise could be heard inside the room behind the closed door. "Would you like to see?" asked Obadiah. He lifted a bar across the door and beckoned me closer. Gently he pushed the door open, and I was startled by a great fluttering of wings. We entered the Mount Zion Pigeon Sanctuary, guarded, cared for, and protected by Obadiah. He spoke softly to the birds in a language which they seemed to understand. He took out of his pocket a handful of grain, and they alighted on his arms, his shoulders, and his dark curly head. Vadia's face beamed with pleasure. He pointed to the structures in the walls. "I made these for the pigeons to nest in," he said. "I've been looking after them and feeding them for the past 10 years. There were only a few when I came." He smiled. "Now there's hardly room enough for all of them." Birds with their young had made their own nests on the floor all around the sides of the walls. The room was filled with fluttering wings. We left the birds to their peaceful, undisturbed life, and Ovadia fastened the door securely behind us. He showed me other rooms, all in the same state of ruin and neglect. Then he led me down the stairs and showed me a less dangerous way out of the house. As we walked in the direction of David's tomb, he proudly showed me his little garden. A few rose bushes were making a great effort to survive between geraniums and other more hardy shrubs. There was ample evidence of his loving care. I recalled the words of one of Israel's prophets foretelling this spirit of kindness. "They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain." And I realized that a ray of the light of Mount Zion had touched the heart of Ovadia. Was this not the house in which those rays of light could shine ever brighter, so that not only birds and flowers, but also people could experience this spirit of kindness? A strong sense of conviction grew in me that this was the house I was looking for. The house on Mount Zion. When some days later I expressed my desire to live in this derelict house right on the border, everyone was shocked at the idea. "Absolutely out of the question," said Dr. Kahani. "Forget all about it." However, my conviction remained strong, and it was not long after that we received, to our complete surprise, a list of conditions that we would have to observe if we were to live in this house on Mount Zion. We were to understand fully the dangers and risks and accept entire responsibility for anything that might happen to us. We could not expect any help in the reconstruction of the building or in obtaining amenities such as light and water. Next, we were to be prepared for any contingency. We might be asked to leave the house any time, even after it had been completed and we were already living there. In addition, since the house stood in a military zone, the army had the right to evacuate us without prior notice. Our sober-minded friends did not believe we would be insane enough, as they put it, to accept such conditions. We accepted. An architect had promised to come and inspect the house, to advise on its restoration. We arrived at the entrance to the barred road. Soldiers were standing guard, and men who had just emerged from a police car were in earnest discussion with officers. I took out my key and approached the padlock barrier. The soldiers, surprised to see a key in my hand, said emphatically, "Nobody is allowed on this road today. It is not safe." I turned to see the architect talking to the police. His face seemed paler. A chilly wind added to our discomfort, and we sensed the tension. What was happening? The rumors flew fast. We were told there were mines on the road. The Arabs were preparing some trouble. It was impossible to use the road. I turned to my companion, the architect, and I asked him, "If we cannot drive up the road, let us walk up the steps. Now that you are here, I would like you to see the house. Please, will you come?" He looked at me worriedly. "Why must you think of a house on Mount Zion?" he exclaimed. "Don't you see the danger? If it's an old Arab house you want, I can show you many in Jerusalem." I smiled and answered, "I am interested in this house, not because it's an old Arab house, but because it stands on Mount Zion. Please come up and have a look at it." Very reluctantly, he walked up the steps with me. At the top of the mount, the silence was broken only by the rustling of the old pine trees under which we walked. The atmosphere was oppressive. Suddenly, my companion looked at his watch, remembered an urgent appointment, and quickly ran back in the direction of the steps, and I never saw him again. I walked on alone to the house. Ovadia was watering the flowers, and the pigeons flew out of the windows, one alighting on his shoulder. Well, we'll take a break now, and we'll continue part 2 of chapter 1 with the announcement of the Pope's visit in January 1964. So until then, goodbye from the window on Mount Zion.